The night my daughter-in-law changed the locks, I was standing in the rain with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere to go. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working the line at a Caterpillar plant outside Peoria, Illinois. I wasn't a rich man, but I wasn't a foolish one either. I owned my house outright. I had a savings account, a small IRA, and a 2009 Ford F-150 that ran just fine. My wife, Susan, and I had built something together, not flashy but solid. The kind of life where you go to sleep at night knowing you'll wake up in the same bed, in the same house, with the same woman beside you. Susan passed from ovarian cancer in March of last year, 14 months of fighting, and then she was gone. I don't have words for what that did to me. I'll just tell you that the house felt like a museum after she left. Every room had a version of her in it. Her reading glasses on the nightstand. Her handwriting on the grocery list still magneted to the fridge. I kept finding things, a lip balm in the junk drawer, a sweater folded in the hall closet, and each time it was like stepping on a nail. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating right. My son, my only child, kept calling and saying, "Dad, you shouldn't be alone out there." His name is my son. That's what I'll call him, because he stopped deserving his name a long time ago. He and his wife lived in Columbus, Ohio, about 2.5 hours east of me. Nice house in a suburb called Dublin. 2 cars in the garage, a Ring doorbell, the whole thing. They'd been married 4 years. I'd never fully warmed to her. She had a way of making you feel like a guest in whatever room you walked into, including rooms that weren't hers. But my son loved her, or said he did, and she made him happy enough on the surface, so I kept my mouth shut. 6 weeks after Susan died, he drove out to Peoria with a proposition. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands and told me the house was too big for one person. He said he was worried about me. He said there was a finished basement in their place in Dublin with its own bathroom and a separate entrance, and that I should come stay with them. "Just for a while, Dad. Just until you get your feet back under you." I want you to understand how much I didn't want to do that. I had lived in Peoria my entire adult life. My friends were there, my routine was there. Susan was buried at Springdale Cemetery on North Galena Road, and I visited her every Sunday morning with coffee and a folding chair. But he kept calling. He kept saying I sounded distant, foggy, not myself. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. I was barely functioning. The grief was like mud. It didn't knock you down. It just made everything slower, heavier, harder to lift your feet out of. So in May, I put my house on the market, sold it in 3 weeks for $218,000, and I moved to Dublin, Ohio, into my son's finished basement with my clothes and Susan's picture and a box of things I couldn't let go of. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was trusting him with the money. He came to me about 3 weeks after I moved in, said he'd been talking to a financial advisor, a guy he knew from his gym, not a licensed professional, though I didn't find that out until later. And there was a real estate investment opportunity that could double my principal in 18 months. He sat at his kitchen table this time, the one I wasn't allowed to eat breakfast at before 9 because his wife needed quiet mornings, and he spread out papers with numbers on them and talked fast about equity and cash flow and limited liability structures. I'm a machinist. I understand torque and tensile strength and how metal behaves under heat. I do not understand investment instruments. I told him that. He said, "Dad, I'm not going to let anything happen to your money. This is our future, yours and mine." I gave him $140,000. I kept $78,000 in my own checking account, which he didn't know about because Susan always told me to keep something they don't know about. She was a smart woman. For 3 months, things were fine. Uncomfortable, but fine. I cooked dinner twice a week when his wife let me use the kitchen. I took walks in the morning. I drove back to Peoria every Sunday to visit Susan's grave. I was lonely in a way I couldn't quite name, not just from missing Susan, but from being invisible inside a house I was partly funding. My son's wife controlled the thermostat, the grocery list, the guest password for the Wi-Fi. She controlled the energy of the whole place. And my son, my boy, who I coached in Little League, who I taught to drive in a Kmart parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, just went along with whatever she said. I noticed things, small things first. She would speak to me directly only when my son was in the room. When he wasn't there, she'd communicate through notes, actual paper notes left on the basement door. "Please don't use the washer before 7 a.m. Guests should park on the street, not the driveway guests." I was paying $1,200 a month in what my son called household contribution, which I'd agreed to so I wouldn't feel like a burden, and she was leaving me notes about the driveway. Then in August, my son sat me down again and said the investment had hit a snag. The market had shifted. He needed another $40,000 to protect what was already in. I said no. He looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. I said, son, I'm not giving you more money until I see some kind of statement, some kind of documentation from whoever is holding this. He got quiet. Then he said, I'm going to pretend you didn't just say that to me. He left the room and I sat there at the kitchen table thinking about what had just happened. About the way he'd looked at me, like I was an obstacle. Not a father, an obstacle. That night I heard them arguing through the floor above me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could make out the tone. Her voice sharp, staccato, certain. His voice lower, apologetic, explaining, and then silence. The next morning there was a new note on my basement door. It said that they needed the space for a home office and that they'd need 30 days to make other arrangements for me. 30 days, like I was a tenant. I called my son. He didn't answer. I texted him. He replied 4 hours later with, "We can talk about it tonight, Dad. It's a complicated situation." We did not talk about it that night because he didn't come home until after 11, and by then I'd already understood that the conversation he intended to have with me was not one I was going to like. What I didn't understand yet was why. I started picking up extra shifts at the only place that would hire a 63-year-old man without a college degree who'd been out of work for 8 months. A regional grocery chain called Fairway Foods, working overnight stocking. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 nights a week, putting cereal boxes and canned goods on shelves in a store that was nearly empty except for the occasional insomniac or night shift nurse grabbing something on her way home. It wasn't glamorous. My back hurt, my feet hurt. But it gave me something to do besides sit in a finished basement thinking about Susan and wondering when my son was going to look me in the eye again. I worked with a small crew. There were 3 of us on most nights, a young woman named Kezia who talked constantly about her nursing school applications, a quiet Haitian man named Aldous who listened to French gospel through one earbud, and the night receiving supervisor, a man named Dale Whitmore. Dale was 58. Big guy, not fat, just built solid, the way men get when they've spent decades doing physical work. He'd driven long-haul trucks for 22 years before a degenerative disc problem forced him off the road. And he talked about those years the way some people talk about a country they had to leave but still loved. He knew the name of every truck stop between Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. He'd eaten breakfast in 34 states. Dale was not a man who spoke a lot, but when he did speak, it counted. The first night we worked together, I dropped a case of tomato paste and it split open on the tile floor, and I stood there for a second just staring at it, and I don't know what was on my face. But Dale walked over, handed me the mop from the utility closet and said, "First time I dropped a load on the highway, I pulled over and cried for about 20 minutes. Doesn't mean you're done." I didn't know what he was talking about exactly, but I felt like he did. We got into a rhythm over the following weeks. Dale always made a pot of coffee at 2 a.m. in the break room, terrible machine coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard, and I'd bring something from home. I started baking again, which Susan used to make fun of me for but secretly loved, so I'd bring zucchini bread or peanut butter cookies or whatever I'd made the previous afternoon, and we'd sit in the break room for 15 minutes and talk. Mostly he talked. I was still too much in my head, but I listened. He told me about his ex-wife, who he'd divorced 15 years ago and still thought about. He told me about a daughter in Savannah who called every Sunday. He told me about the way the country looks at 4 a.m. from the cab of an 18-wheeler, when the road is empty and the sky is just starting to go gray in the east. He made it sound almost beautiful. One night in September, a Wednesday, I came into work and Dale took one look at me and said, "What happened?" I'd gotten home from my Sunday visit to Susan's grave and found a locksmith van in the driveway. I stood on the porch for 20 minutes knocking before my son opened the door. He stood in the doorway, didn't open the screen, just stood there, and told me that they'd decided the arrangement wasn't working. He said they'd moved my things into a storage unit on Sawmill Road and paid for the first month. He said I could pick up the key at the unit's front office. His wife appeared behind him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I asked my son, "Where am I supposed to go?" He said, "Dad, you're a grown man. You'll figure it out." And he closed the door. I told Dale all of that at 2 a.m. over bad coffee and the last 2 slices of zucchini bread I'd made the previous Saturday, not knowing it would be the last thing I'd bake in that kitchen. Dale listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Have you looked at the money?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The $140,000. Have you asked to see any kind of record of where it actually went?" I hadn't. I'd asked for documentation, but I hadn't pushed. I'd accepted my son's deflections as explanations. Dale looked at me carefully and said, "My ex-wife's brother did something similar to their parents. 18 months. By the time anyone looked at it directly, there was nothing left to look at." That night, instead of going back to the motel on I-270 where I'd been staying since the locksmith incident, I went to the Columbus Public Library when it opened at 9 and sat down at a public computer terminal. I knew the name of the investment company my son had mentioned, Apex Horizon Capital. I'd written it down at the time because I wanted to do my own research and then forgot about it in the fog of grief. I looked it up. There was nothing registered under that name with the Ohio Division of Securities, no SEC filings, no Better Business Bureau listing, nothing. The only result that came up was a generic LLC registration from 2021 listed to a residential address in Westerville, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. The address was my son's wife's sister's house. I sat in that library chair and felt the floor drop out from under me. I'm going to tell you something about grief that no one warned me about. It doesn't make you stupid, but it makes you tired in a way that looks like stupidity from the outside. I had been so worn down by losing Susan, so hollowed out, that I had handed my son $140,000 of the life she and I had built together, and I had not asked a single hard question. I drove to the Franklin County Courthouse that same afternoon and filed a fraud complaint. The clerk at the window, a young man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, walked me through the forms without making me feel like an idiot, which I appreciated more than I could say. Then I called a lawyer. I used the Ohio State Bar Association's referral line and found a civil litigation attorney named Beverly Ossie who specialized in financial fraud. She saw me 2 days later in her office on East Broad Street. I laid out everything I had. The conversation at the table, the verbal agreement, the name of the fake company, the address that linked to his wife's family. She listened. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she set down a pen and said, "Do you have any written communication? Texts, emails, anything?" I had my son's text messages going back 14 months. I had an email he'd sent me in June with the investment name and the amount and the phrase, "I'll take care of this, Dad, you have my word." Beverly Ossie said, "That'll do." What followed was 4 months that I will not describe in detail because the details are repetitive and humiliating, not for me but for my son. And I find I cannot take pleasure in that even now. The short version is this. The money had gone into an account jointly held by my son and his wife, and from there into renovations on their house. A new kitchen, a master bath addition, a stamped concrete patio that I now understood was why she'd needed quiet mornings. The investment company had never existed. There were no assets to recover from it because there had never been any assets. But because of the documentation, the email, the texts, the LLC registration linked to her family, Beverly was able to argue successful civil fraud. The court ordered a lien on their property and a judgment of $162,000, which included the principal plus interest and legal fees. They couldn't pay it immediately. They didn't have it liquid. What they had was the equity in the house which they'd been building, with my money for 4 years. They sold the house. I was not in the courtroom the day it finalized. Beverly had offered to call me and I said, "Yes, please. Call me when it's done." She called me on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. while I was sitting in the break room at Fairway Foods with a cup of bad coffee, waiting for my shift to end. I didn't cry. I didn't feel what I expected to feel, which I think I'd imagined as triumphant. I felt tired. And then after a minute I felt something settle in me. Something that had been pulled tight since the night I stood in the rain with my garbage bag. And I felt it loosen, just slightly. Enough. Dale was restocking the juice aisle when I found him. I told him it was over. He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded once the way he did and said, "You hungry? I know a diner on 5th that does a real breakfast." We went eggs over easy, wheat toast, hash browns with hot sauce. Dale had the same thing he always had, black coffee and a short stack with butter, no syrup. We talked for 2 hours, not about the case, not about my son, about Susan, mostly, about Dale's daughter in Savannah, about whether I might want to take a drive sometime, not for any reason, just to be moving the way Dale used to when the roads were his. He said there was something about motion that made certain things easier to hold. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the northwest side of Columbus the following month. It's on the 3rd floor. I have a little balcony where I put a feeder out for the finches. I cook for myself, real cooking, not the careful invisible cooking I'd been doing in someone else's kitchen. I went back to visiting Susan on Sundays, but now I have a longer drive, so I leave earlier and stop for gas station coffee on the way, which she would have hated, and I talk to her about that sometimes. Tell her she should have lived longer if she wanted to control my coffee choices. Dale and I eat breakfast at that diner on 5th most Tuesday mornings. He's teaching himself guitar from YouTube videos. He plays badly, he knows it, and he doesn't care. I still work at Fairway Foods, though only 3 nights a week now. I don't need the money the way I did. but I've found that I like the quiet of a store at 2 a.m., the empty aisles, the hum of the freezer cases. There's something honest about stocking shelves. You put a thing where it belongs and it stays there. My son has not contacted me. I don't know where he and his wife are living now. I don't look for that information. What I know is this. I came to Columbus because I was lonely and afraid and still half lost in grief, and I handed my trust to someone who had stopped deserving it a long time before I noticed. That's on me, and I've made my peace with it. Susan used to say that the worst thing you can do with a mistake is refuse to learn its shape, so I've learned it. I know what it looks like now. I also know what it looks like when someone sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway, not because they owe you, not because there's something in it for them, just because you're there and you're trying, and that's enough. Dale Whitmore didn't rescue me. I want to be clear about that. I rescued myself with the help of a good lawyer and whatever was left of my own stubbornness. But Dale was the person who sat across from me at 2 a.m. and asked the question that unlocked everything. Have you looked at the money? 4 words. Sometimes that's all it takes, not a hero, not a miracle. Just someone paying enough attention to ask the right thing at the right time. I turned 64 in November. Dale brought a carrot cake from the Giant Eagle Bakery to the break room and didn't tell anyone it was my birthday, so it was just the two of us eating cake on our 15-minute break at 3 a.m. while Kezia studied her nursing flashcards at the other table. It was without question one of the better birthdays I have had. There is a framed photo of Susan on the bookshelf in my apartment. She's laughing in it, really laughing, head back, completely unguarded. It was taken at a barbecue in 1997. I look at it every morning when I make coffee. I think she would have liked Dale. She had a gift for recognizing solid things. I think she would have told me, if she could, that losing everything you built with someone doesn't mean everything is lost. That what you built with them, the patience, the stubbornness, the willingness to start over, that part goes with you. It's not in the house. It's not in the money. It's in what you do with the morning after the worst night. And the morning after my worst night, I drove to a library on a Tuesday, sat down at a computer and started asking questions. That's the whole story. That's all there is. I'm still here. That's enough.